Why didn't Matthew Judon live up to the hype in Atlanta? And is Arnold Ebiketie going to be the next Robin here with the Falcons?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. We're going to help you find the qualified candidates that you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. Terms and conditions apply. So if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for a very long time, almost 2 decades, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong in this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that goes strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you have to do to become an everyday or subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it is available. So today we are continuing our positional reviews, talking about the defense, talking about the edge rusher position. We'll talk about to 4-3 or not to 4-3. Will Zach Harrison be making a move back to the edge in the future? What's next for the Falcons at this position? What prompted Arnold Ebiketie's year three growth? But we got to start with what went wrong with this edge rusher position, and that is, of course, the Falcons' acquisition of Matthew Judon not living up to the hype. The Falcons traded a third-round pick for Judon back in August with the expectation that he would be kind of their new Batman, that double-digit sack guy that the Falcons have lacked for so many years. You know, the last time they had a double-digit sack guy at that edge rusher position was Vic Beasley back in 2016. And Matthew Judon did not live up to the hype. He fell short of those expectations. And I thought Judon did get off to a decent start this past year, like through the first 5 games. I thought, based off my charting, him and Grady Jarrett were kind of neck and neck in terms of leading the team with pressures and whatnot. But it felt like around week 6 and through the bye week, his production fell off of a cliff. And that also seemed to coincide with Arnold Ebiketie's emergence during that 6-game stretch. But during that 6-game stretch before the bye week from week 6 on, based off my charting, Matthew Judon's production was marginally better than that of James Smith-Williams. And I think because of the lack of production that he had during that middle stretch of the season, the Falcons started to shift him away from being primarily a pass rusher and asking him to do edge stuff that, made them indicate that they weren't necessarily buying into his ability as a pass rusher, because they dropped him in the coverage a lot more. Through the first 7 games of the season, about 12% of Judon's passing down snaps saw him drop into coverage. After that point, it was 27%. And that's not quite the 40% of, coverage snaps on passing downs that you saw with Michael Hoyt as that outside linebacker under Raheem Morris in 2023. And you saw a similar number under Chris Shula with the Rams in 2024. But 27% coverage rate is certainly near the top of the league as far as edge rushers go, where it comes to when you're being asked to drop into coverage. And again, that's a testament to me to what little regard the Falcons had as Judon as a pass rusher, that they kind of seemingly were like, yeah, this is the best usage of you at this stage with all the simulated pressures that we're doing defensively. We don't really value you as a pass rusher. And, the question, of course, is why did Judon fall off so hard from 3 years of 2.3 years of very productive football in New England, because he was hurt, missed 13 games in 2023 due to a torn biceps or whatever, and the injury had nothing to do with his dramatic fall off. But despite praising that trade back in August, as we often did, beggars cannot be choosers. We did note several potential red flags surrounding Matthew Judon here on the podcast, and why that trade might not necessarily live up to the hype that it was getting at the time. And the first factor in that, red flag was Judon's advanced age, right? He turned 32 the day that the Falcons executed that trade. And the age 32 is around that time when you start to see a lot of high-end pass rushers start to fall off. Right, you just start to get diminishing returns from a lot of these guys, after the age of 31. And you wondered, okay, how much left is in the tank with Matthew Judon? It was a reason why the Patriots felt like they didn't necessarily need to have to, sign him to a multi-year contract that he was looking for, which prompted them to trade him. and he was hoping to earn in Atlanta and didn't necessarily earn. And the other factor that was a red flag was just how Judon got a lot of that production in New England, right? That if you, he was a player that we noted, had a higher rate of coverage and cleanup sacks than other high-end pass rushers that had similar sack production, right? If you look at the 15 edges over the last 3 seasons that averaged about 10 or more sacks over the course of their seasons, Judon was at the bottom of that group of edges that in terms of what percentage of his sacks were high-quality sacks, according to Brandon Thorne of Trench Warfare, it was about 27% for Judon. And the average among that 15-player sample was about 45%. So, for those of you not familiar with what Brandon Thorne breaks down as high-quality sacks, it's basically, where the pass rusher wins, beats a blocker due to skill, move, or athletic ability. Low-quality sacks are an unblocked sack, a skiing sack, such as on a stunt or a twist, basically where no special skill or move was required for that guy to get a sack. And then you have coverage and cleanup sacks, which are effort sacks resulting from excellent secondary work, missed sack from another opponent, or the quarterback hanging on to the ball too long. And Judon's, in terms of those coverage and cleanup sacks, his number was 24%, when the other premier edges, those top 15 guys, that number was about 15%. So he was getting about twice as many sort of cleanup sacks than your typical double-digit sack guy, and he wasn't beating as many offensive linemen to get those sacks as your typical guy was. And so, for that reason, I kind of expected his sack production to not be as good in Atlanta as it was in New England the last couple of years, but I still figured we should comfortably be able to get, 7 or 8 sacks this season. We should comfortably be able to get, 50, 60 pressures from Judon this upcoming season. And we didn't get, anywhere that. I think PFF had him at 25 pressures. I think I charted him at 34, 35. Yeah, 35 pressures this past season. So, not good enough. And even if the Judon had lived up to the expectations, like, he still would have been a Band-Aid solution. He wouldn't have solved the Falcons pass rush problems, but he would have kind of papered over it for a couple of years because we would still be probably heading into this offseason feeling like, hey, take an edge, because we're looking not just for, if Judon was that Batman type of player, it would have just been for 1 or 2 years. And then we would have been having the debate on whether or not we should pay Judon and what he's worth this offseason. And we still need to draft that guy, early in this upcoming 2025 draft still nonetheless. So, at this stage, I would be shocked if Judon is back in Atlanta in 2025. I think all parties are going to look for a fresh start. If you want to blame the coverage stuff on Jimmy Lake, which I don't think is particularly accurate, because again, just look at Michael Hoyt and how Raheem used him the previous year. But I think there's little reason for Judon to want to come back to Atlanta based off of how he was used this past year, dropping in the coverage so much in the back half of the season. And I think there's little reason for the Falcons to want to bring back Judon, basically because they were so willing to drop him into coverage in the back half of the season, basically telling us that they don't really believe in his pass rush ability. So, Judon's decline this upcoming season was a major disappointment, but don't let that negative overshadow the positive that came out of this edge rusher position, which was the rise of Arnold Ebiketie as that Robin type, and we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So, as a small business owner, your work doesn't end when the clock hits 5, and your business is always on your mind, which means that when it comes to hire, you need a partner that's going to work just as hard as you do. And that's where LinkedIn Jobs comes in. When you clock out, LinkedIn clocks in. LinkedIn is going to make it easy to post your job for free, share it with your network, and get qualified candidates all in one place. And when you post your job, LinkedIn has a new feature that can help you write job descriptions and then quickly get your job in front of the right people with deep candidate insights. And here's a pro tip: add the hashtag hiring frame to your profile picture to double the reach to qualified candidates. No wonder 72% of small businesses say LinkedIn helps them find high quality hires. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So I think one of the positives of 2024 from a pass rush standpoint was the rise of Arnold Ebiketie. That began, as I mentioned earlier, around week 6. Pro Football Focus had him with 35 pressures over the final 11 games of the season. That would extrapolate to 54 over a full 17-game season, which would be more pressures than TJ Watt, Will Anderson, Montez Sweat, and Khalil Mack had in 2024. It would be the same number of pressures that Josh Sweat and Max Crosby had in 2024. And I'm not suggesting that Arnold Ebiketie is on the same level as those guys I just named, but he reached a level that I think is generally recognized across the league as a good pass rusher for those final 11 games. You look at those final 11 in terms of total pressures. He was 80th percentile among edge rushers. He was 64th percentile among edge rushers in terms of win rate, according to PFF. And then he was 75th percentile in true pass set win rate. And true pass sets are basically where you take out screens and play action and rollouts and have normal time to throw and not 3-man rushes, basically times where it's just kind of like pin your ears back, get after the quarterback. Do you win consistently? And he was 75th percentile among edge rushers in those situations last year. And so that to me showed me that at least over the last 11 games of the season, I thought Arnold Ebiketie performed like you would say a Robin would, right? He looked very Robin-esque in that regard, in the Batman Robin perspective in terms of pass rushers. And so I think it's fair to say that he had his year 3 breakout. I know there was a lot of rhetoric going into the season about what type of breakout season Arnold Ebiketie would have had. I think a lot of people looked at his sacks relative to how little playing time he got in 2023 and expected a lot more, 6 sacks on 175 snaps rushing the quarterback in 2023. And I think a lot of people were like, oh, he's going to get twice as many opportunities. And so therefore he's going to get like 12 plus sacks and have that double-digit sack season. And if you listen to this podcast, we were very skeptical of that because, we don't just look at the stat sheets to assess players. We actually watched the film. And I think when you watched the film last year, it wasn't as impressive as the stat sheets would suggest it was. But I do think the film was pretty impressive watching Arnold Ebiketie this year. Like, for me this year, he was actually beating guys as opposed to, I think a lot of last year was kind of clean up plays. A lot of it was stunts and twists and all that stuff when it came to a lot of that production that he had last year. And so I think he showed that tremendous growth that you wanted to see in year 3. We'll see if he can continue that growth in year 4, or the version of what we got in Arnold Ebiketie in year 3 is what we can expect to get from him year after year moving forward. And I think he's on the path to earning a second contract. I think he has to do it again this upcoming season in 2025 to definitely earn that. And then, if he can build off of the 2024 season, that will, put him into a different, tax bracket, so to speak, versus, if he just kind of maintains it in terms of what that price tag is. But we'll talk about that, I guess, later. Well, we'll find out what the market is in March when some of these other guys hit the market that are in a similar boat as Arnold Ebiketie, the Azeez Ojularis, the Baron Browns, the Josh Uches, those types of guys that will be hitting the market and see what they can get. And that will kind of determine what we think AK's price tag could be a year from now. But, I've seen some people kind of frame Ebiketie's development, and so that we had to wait till this past season for him to have that breakout year as a slow development. I don't really think that's fair because, I think year 3 is typically the norm in the NFL. When it comes to pass rushers, really comes to most players in the NFL, that they don't really have their breakout years until year 3. I just think we focus on the guys that have that instant impact in years 1 and 2. And so we just sort of assume that's the norm when it's not. And I think the big thing with AK was that when he had those one-on-one opportunities this year as opposed to last year, I thought he was much more effective taking advantage of that. I think one of the ways that he was very effective was on stunts, particularly when it was him and Grady Jarrett lined up on the same side, and they would, run twists and stunts on that side. And usually one of those guys seemed to get home whenever the Falcons tried to do that throughout the season. And so hopefully we'll continue to see that. Hopefully we'll talk more about, whether or not Grady Jarrett will be around tomorrow on the pod. But I also saw, the technical pass rush ability of Arnold Ebiketie kind of come into its own in year 3. And I think this is something that I've observed over the years. Of typically it does take them about to the 3rd year for guys to kind of develop the technique. And that was something that AK showed in college at Penn State, that he was primarily a technical pass rusher, which was a guy that won using moves rather than just relying on, pure athleticism, like his speed and power that he had in abundance, but that wasn't necessarily his go-to way. And I think that contributed to the quote unquote slower start than I think people expected. And I think that's going to be a factor moving forward, when, I'm personally evaluating pass rushers, or like, are they technical pass rushers? Well, maybe that means that it may take them the better part of 3 years for that technique to develop, to hone that technique, to allow them to maximize that ability as pass rushers. And in the first 2 years, you want to sort of see what sort of physical skills, that speed, that power, that they can kind of lean on until they figure it all out from a technical standpoint. But it did seem like Arnold Ebiketie started to figure it out and understanding, okay, I can use this move against this guy and that will be effective against him, and I can use this other move against this guy. And again, that is something that I think it takes some time, unless you're, a Bosa brother level prodigy or something like that can kind of instantly figure that stuff sort of out in the NFL. So that will be something that we'll be paying attention to, especially when we talk about pass rushers, especially as we get closer to this year's draft, given the expectation that, the Falcons will invest, some of those premium assets in the draft. But, free agency, happens, and we'll talk a little bit more about what's next for the Falcons in terms of, do they invest in free agency, as well as, what scheme are the Falcons going to run? Are they going to stick with the 3-4? Are they going to stick with the move back to the 4-3? And what does that mean for, say, a player like Zach Harrison? And we'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So the big game is here, and there's no better way to make it more exciting than with PrizePicks, the best play to play daily fantasy sports, with over 10 million members and billions in winnings awarded. PrizePicks is going to make it fun and simple to get in on the action. It's easy. Here's how it works. You just pick more or less on at least 2 player stat projections, and if you're right, you can win up to 1,000 times your cash. PrizePicks even has a free pick for the big game, where Patrick Mahomes only needs to throw 1 yard in order for you to win. Pair that with one more correct pick and you're cashing out. I've already put in my other hopefully correct pick, which is more on Saquon Barkley getting 0.5 rushing and receiving touchdowns. He just got to score 1 touchdown in that game, and boom, I'm winning. That's how easy it is. And so you can take advantage of that. Hey guys, and you're sitting there going like, well, Aaron just stole my pick. I would have done that. It's like, hey, that's the beautiful thing about PrizePicks. It's just you versus projections. Every single person that listens to this podcast can put in that same bet of more on Mahomes yards and Saquon touchdowns, and you'll win money. It's just you versus the projections, not you versus any other player. So that's how great PrizePicks is. So download the app today. Make sure you use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5. PrizePicks, run your game. Hello, my friends. It's me from France, coming to tell you about Gametime and their new feature, Gametime Picks, which is going to allow you to get incredible deals on great seats, and you don't have to waste any time searching through thousands of tickets. And you can get to State Farm Arena as your next big event to watch your favorite Frenchman, Zachary Risacher, fill the Jalen Johnson-sized hole in your heart, and along with my favorite Trey Young, or as we say in my country, Toi Young, how do you say, shoot the lights out of State Farm Arena. So go check it out, whether it's basketball, other sports, comedy, music, theater, whatever event is near you. Gametime is taking the guesswork at the buying tickets. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. $20. Oh, you save so many euros. Terms apply. Again, create account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Game time. So obviously the Falcons have a big need at edge, arguably the biggest need on their roster, right? The assumption that almost everybody's going to make is, we're going to see so many mock drafts between now and April that are suggesting this, that the Falcons are going to use that 15th overall pick on an edge rusher, right? And the way I look at it, I think the Falcons need 2 edges, right? You have a couple of guys under contract. Arnold Ebiketie, Braylon Trice, D'Angelo Malone are under contract. Khalid Kareem, if you want to throw him in the mix as well. Matthew Judon's a free agent. James Smith-Williams a free agent. Lorenzo Carter, Damon Harris, all free agents. Of that group, James Smith-Williams and Damon Harris are probably the 2 guys that I could see the Falcons trying to re-sign on like a 1-year vet minimum contract to bolster depth or whatever. But we obviously did not get to see Braylon Trice this past year, their 3rd round pick in 2024, because he missed all the season with an ACL tear, suffered in that first preseason game. D'Angelo Malone did finish the season relatively strong, coming on strong late in the season after the bye week, where he was kind of getting a lot of those pass rushing opportunities that Matthew Judon was getting earlier in the season. But I think D'Angelo Malone at this stage remains a back-end rotational guy and primarily a special teams guy. I wouldn't go into the season expecting D'Angelo Malone to be more than the fourth or fifth guy in that rotation. And I think when you're looking at four edges in that rotation, I think you have two that you're expecting, significant contributions from on defense next year in Arnold Ebiketie and Braylon Trice. And so that means to me, you need to add two this offseason. And ideally, you can add one in free agency and one very early in the 2025 draft, preferably in round one. More on that as the offseason wears on. But I'm sure some of you guys are sitting there going, but what about Zach Harrison, though? Right? And we'll talk a little bit more about Zach Harrison tomorrow when we get into the interior D-line and to assess his season. But, I think with the hiring of Jeff Ulbrich as the new Falcons defensive coordinator, there are many that expect the Falcons to move back to a 4-3 defensive front. I'm skeptical of that. We'll get into why I'm skeptical of that in a second. But, let's say I'm wrong and the Falcons are moving back to a 4-3 front. In theory, Zach Harrison could move back to DN like he showed in his rookie season. And, now you have three out of the four edges at that spot. So you've just kind of solved one of those problems internally, right? So in theory, that's true. Yes. But I feel like if you are moving back to a 4-3, when it comes to how are you going to fill that last spot, it kind of pigeonholes you into a certain type of edge rusher that you're going to look for, especially in the draft, right? That you need to get one of those bigger edges, those bigger DNs, given the prevalence of playing soft boxes in today's NFL, and especially if you're talking about the Robert Saleh scheme that Jeff Ulbrich called in New York, they played with a lot of light boxes, and you saw that here in Atlanta when we were a 4-3 team in 2023 under Ryan Nielsen, where you wanted those bigger edges so that you could play with those light boxes with all the nickel that teams are playing. And so you kind of need guys that hit a certain weight, 265, 270 is kind of the minimum at that stage. And so the Mike Greens, the James Pierces, the Jalen Walker types that I think a lot of people are looking at for the Falcons in round one, potentially as their edge rushers, drafting those guys doesn't make a ton of sense, in my humble opinion, if you're going to go to a 4-3 defense. Instead, you're looking at guys like Mikael Williams out of Georgia, Shamar Stewart out of Texas A&M, and you're kind of pigeonholing yourself to going after a specific type of edge if you're going to play a 4-3 in today's NFL. And that's why I think the Falcons are going to stick with a 3-4. They could dabble with a little bit more 4-3 looks, as we saw them do kind of in week 10 this past year. And certainly it makes sense to incorporate some of that depending on the matchup that they have. But, a 4-3, we saw what Arnold Ebiketie is in a 4-3. I don't think Arnold Ebiketie, again, while I think he's an effective run defender for a player his size, I don't think you're asking Arnold Ebiketie in today's NFL. You might have done it a decade ago, right? Because, Seattle had a similar player in Chris Clemens playing that role in Seattle, but the league is very different in 2025 than it was in 2013 when Chris Clemens was doing that stuff. But we saw Arnold Ebiketie play more of that Sam linebacker role in that 4-3 under front, which is why he had limited opportunities to rush the quarterback in 2023, because really at that stage, you're really only a designated pass rusher in that type of defense. And you saw something similar with Will McDonald in New York, right? He got drafted in round one at 15 overall in 2023 and barely played his rookie season because the Jets already had an established designated pass rusher in Bryce Huff. And the guys that actually got more snaps than Bryce Huff were John Franklin Myers and Jermaine Johnson, guys that were a little bit bigger, more 3-down types of players in that DN role. And then when Bryce Huff and Jermaine Johnson gets hurt and John Franklin Myers gets traded, they promote Will McDonald to be an every down player. And again, he didn't struggle as a pass rusher, finished with 10.5 sacks this year, but definitely struggled as a run defender. And it kind of broke the Jets defense, as we've discussed a number of times since the hiring of Jeff Ulbrich, that style of player doesn't really work in that style of defense. So that's why, to me, it doesn't make a ton of sense to switch back to a 4-3. I think with the exception of maybe Brandon Dorlus, most of your young, talented defenders on rookie contracts that you're hoping to build your defense around, whether we're talking about Arnold Ebiketie, Ruka Roro, et cetera, are more suited towards a 3-4. I think and Zach Harrison, I think, can play in either one. But, you're kind of wasting a year of Zach Harrison's development as a 3-4 defensive end if you move him back to a 4-3 defensive end, So we'll see. And, for me, if you're the Falcons and you want to maximize your chances of hitting on a draft, especially a round one edge, and you're looking at these top 12 to 15 edges in this draft class, if you go into a 4-3, like, you're kind of eliminating like 60% of those guys from your draft board, or at least, they're not going to be nearly as high on your draft board as other guys are going to be. And so that to me is why it doesn't make a ton of sense if you're the Falcons. If you want to maximize your chances of getting a good pass rusher at 15 or even in round 2 or 3, stick with the 3-4 because there's more 3-4 guys than 4-3 guys in this upcoming draft. So we'll see if the Falcons take that advice. That's why I sit here and I go, I think we could dabble with some more 4-3 looks, 4-3 under fronts and whatnot, which is kind of a hybrid 3-4, 4-3 defense anyway. But for the most part, I feel like stick with the 3-4. It fits your personnel a lot better currently than the 4-3 does. So hopefully we'll see the Falcons also get aggressive in free agency in addition to all this draft stuff that we're going to continue to talk about for the next, 3+ months or almost 3 months, I guess, 2.7 months or whatever the math is. But, my hope is that the Falcons get aggressive in free agency because I don't think just relying on that first round pick is going to solve their pass rush issues, right? To me, if we're assuming that Judon is walking, you draft a guy at 15, that's really just going to be a lateral move for the Falcons because the production that you would expect in year 1. Now, again, the production that you would expect in year 3 and 4 for that first round pick is definitely very different than that year 1 production. But in year 1, that rookie is most likely to contribute basically the same as what Judon contributed this past year, right? Judon had 5.5 sacks, 9 quarterback hits, 25 pressures on 328 pass rushing snaps this past year. If you look at the 4 edges that have been taken 15th overall since 2010, that's Jason Pierre-Paul, Bruce Irvin, Laiatu Latu, and Will McDonald. Their average year 1 production has been about 5.2 sacks, 12 quarterback hits, 32 pressures on 309 pass rushing snaps. So a little bit better than Judon, but not like, oh man, this is solving all the Falcons pass rushing needs, right? Basically the same sacks, slightly more hits, slightly more pressures on a similar workload as we saw with Matthew Judon. And so to me, again, if the goal is we're just going to swap out Judon and it's going to be him, it's going to be the rookie first round pick, Arnold Ebiketie, Braylon Trice, and, D'Angelo Malone or Khalid Kareem or James Smith-Williams as that 4th edge, that to me is not substantially better room than what you had in 2024. And as we saw in 2024, with the Falcons finishing second to last in sack production and having, a bottom 5 pass rush for most of the season outside of a 5-game stretch after the bye, that wasn't good enough. And so hopefully we will not see that level of complacency with the Falcons in terms of their edge rush position. We will see them be aggressive in free agency. They missed the boat last year in free agency. Hopefully they do not make that same mistake, that hopefully in those first couple of days, that by that Friday, starting out, so that would be the 16th or whatever it is, 15, 16, somewhere around there, in that first week of free agency, we'll be doing an episode breaking down a new pass rusher the Falcons have signed. Hopefully, but we'll see on that front. So you guys know me as Mr. Drew, that negative Nancy. I tend to be pessimistic at this stage. So hopefully, this team can win back, so many hearts and minds, at least on this podcast, by, being proactive in that first, wave of free agency, trying to address some of these issues and not sitting it out like they did last year, because that thing dried up real quick. I don't think it's going to be as likely to dry up this year, just because I think teams are not going to be as aggressive. To me, if we want to get into it, I suspect last year teams were very proactive in those first couple of days of free agency, where it really dried up by Thursday in that first week in terms of good pass rushers to sign, in large part due to the lack of depth in the draft class. And there was basically 3 edge rushers that were projected to be round 1 guys, and then there was a steep decline after that point. And so teams were like, we gotta get our guy now, right? And you saw similar issues with other positions in last year's free agency because of the perception that this year's draft class at edge is going to be a lot deeper. I don't think the well is going to dry up as nearly as quickly as it did, but you don't want to see the Falcons just twiddling their thumbs. They're like, oh, we'll be fine, we can wait 12 days and still get a guy. I'm like, all right, I don't know if you might be able to get the guy on day 4 or day 5, unlike last year, but I don't feel like you can wait another week and feel good about that. So we'll see how that all plays out, but obviously we'll have more information on that as we get closer to March when free agency kicks off. We'll continue these positional reviews tomorrow, talking about the interior D-line. We'll talk about the futures of veterans like Grady Jarrett, David Onyemata. Do the Falcons need news nose tackle? What can we expect from guys like Zach Harrison, Ruka Rorwell, Brandon Dorlus, as they hope to follow in the Arnold Ebiketie footsteps and with making some year 2 and or 3 jumps next year. So that will be all topics of discussion tomorrow on Locked On Falcons. Continue to make us your first listen by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure you check out Locked On NFL, 2 shows daily to get you the low down gearing up to this big game this weekend, as well as the ongoing coaching search. And of course, check out Locked On NBA, big trades, right? Going on in the NBA, Locked On Mavs, Locked On Lakers, Locked On NBA. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.